All right, session one. So we're looking at the health policy outlook for 2026. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator, Kristen Wang. She is the health reporter at CalMatters. I encourage you to look at her bio and, more importantly, look at the body of work that she's produced. It's pretty amazing. Kristen.
Thank you so much, Hope. As Hope said, good morning and welcome to the annual Healthcare Forecast Conference. My name is Kristen Wong and I'm a healthcare reporter with CalMatters, a nonprofit news organization that covers California politics and policy. As has been mentioned by all of the wonderful people ahead of me, healthcare is undergoing tremendous policy shifts under the second Trump administration. Upheavals at the CDC, deals with drug makers made primarily by threat, and of course, the massive spending reductions included in H.R. 1. And just in these few examples, I think the impacts of those hardly need reiterating in this audience. But there is also a lot of uncertainty there. I think every sort of phone call and interview that I've done over the past year, the theme of which has been uncertainty. But we are all very, very lucky to have with us today Dean Rosen to sort of walk us through some of those major status quo shifts and look towards the future, give us a forecast, if you will, of what is possibly to come. Dean has been with Mellman Consulting for more than 2 decades and is one of the foremost experts on politics and policy, or how politics and policy shape the American healthcare system. So with that, I will let you take it away.
Thanks. Thank you, Kristen. That was a nice introduction, and I want to thank the good folks here at UC Irvine for having me back. Dean Williamson, Dr. Shaw, Dr. Goldstein, and Diane Ford and her team for making things, as you said, just amazingly smooth. And I know how difficult it is to put on a conference like this. I also want to do a shout out to the students. I also look forward to seeing you at the bar. 1990 was the year that I started my career after graduating from law school. So I know it's an important time in sort of shaping the beginning of your career, and as Dean Williamson said, kind of what's old is new again. We're dealing with some of the same issues. So I'm honored to be invited back, and I'm humbled by the fact that you think that anybody can explain to you what's going on in Washington, D.C., particularly me. But we're going to do a couple things today. First, I want to sort of start off with the outlook for health policy generally, how the president is approaching policymaking specifically or generally, and then specifically on healthcare. And I know the second panel is going to do a much deeper dive on that. I want to talk about the congressional health policy in the election year, because even though President Trump has been extremely dominant in policymaking in the news cycle, Congress has had a really critical role, and I think will play one. And then finally, I want to end with a little bit of politics, because that's fun stuff, and it's almost always an election year. Well, I do have a difficult task, but there are 2 things that make it a little bit easier today. One, you've really assembled an all-star cast of speakers and panelists for the rest of the day, and so they're going to correct what I say or fill in a lot of the details, and I'll try to provide a high level, but I'm really looking forward to learning from friends and colleagues throughout the day. You've got a terrific panel for the rest of the day. And second, the other thing that's going to help me a little bit is the Academy Awards. Now, I saw some hands of folks who have not been here before, but just raise your hands if you've never been here before. Okay, so the folks sitting next to you will explain that a number of years ago, when I've been invited back, I love movies, and I was always thought about the proximity and time-wise and also geographically to the Academy Awards. And I tried to, in almost every year, explain or try to explain what's going on in our broader political and policy environment by reflecting on the Academy Award nominated movies. Last year, I really had a hard time doing it. Some of the titles just really did not lend themselves to it. But this year, there are a few First of all, I will just say, as you've seen, we are now in the midst of our third federal government shutdown. It's a partial government shutdown, so TSA and other things are not funded. But as Kristen talked about at the beginning, we started off 2025 in the first part of the Trump administration with DOGE cuts, mass layoffs, unprecedented use of executive orders, controversial immigration tactics, drug smuggler, boat bombings, and a lot of tension in Washington. And of course, no movie defines that better than this, one battle after another. And by the way, ChatGPT is amazing for coming up with photos as well of our congressional leaders. The centerpiece of 2025 really was about the Republicans passing over $4 trillion in tax cuts, which the president and the Republicans called the one big, beautiful bill. And it is beautiful if you're a Republican. The reduction in the taxes, making permanent the 2017 taxes, the no tips on overtime, no tax on other Social Security, and of course, this is going to be the centerpiece of what Republicans campaign on. The Democrats have a different name for it in a movie that they use to describe it, which is this. They call it the one big ugly bill. And we'll talk about some of the Medicaid changes and other things that will be part of the election. Now, I will say I saw a poll from CBS just released a couple weeks ago that said that the public now, a year into the administration, is feeling the following words: uneasy, frustrated, and exhausted. And the pace in Washington, as we'll talk about in a minute, has been frenetic. And after 1 year of the Trump presidency, a lot of the congressional Republicans and establishment Republicans having to face an electorate that feels this way, a little bit uneasy, says, yes, we get it. The president is unorthodox, and that's why people like him. Right? He's breaking past norms. He's stepping outside the lines. His approach may be controversial, but the ends justify the means. And I think the movie that summarizes that is this: wicked for good. Yeah, and the Academy didn't buy it either. But finally, I think the big question this year in the Academy Awards is whether Timothée Chalamet, after losing last year after an amazing performance portraying Bob Dylan in A Complete Unknown and losing to Adrian Brody, will be able to capture the Best Actor award for his role in Marty Supreme. Have you seen Marty Supreme? Table tennis. It's an amazing movie. The biggest question in Washington is about something else, which is whether the Supreme Court, the third branch of government, which we often forget about and don't talk about, will step in a number of key cases this year and put its own mark on constitutional authority of the president. So with that, let us switch from the big picture to some of the healthcare issues in front of us. So there's a lot going on in Washington. Let me sort of frame up, as we head into 2026, the big picture that the rest of the panels are going to fill in the rest of the day. First of all, there's a growing focus, as Dean Williamson said, there was back in 1990, on affordability, with a lot of scrutiny on sectors, particularly biopharma and healthcare companies, health plans in particular, which are under enormous scrutiny. You'll hear more about these one-off deals that are being made with drug companies, but things like PBM profits, Medicare Advantage reimbursement, coding, 340B drug program, the site neutrality for hospitals and drug pricing are critical. The other big issue is going to be a massive effort at both the state level, which you'll hear about, I think, in the second panel, as well as at the federal level, to implement the One Big Beautiful Bill, or H.R. 1. So it did include significant tax cuts, but also to help offset the cost of those. There are about $1.5 trillion in spending reductions, the biggest portion of that, over $1 trillion, from reductions in healthcare spending, both the ACA and Medicaid. And a lot of that will have to be implemented, we'll talk about. And then politically, we'll get to this in the last moment, but absolutely, I think healthcare is going to be an important part of the election, and you'll hear Democrats attacking Republicans for letting the Affordable Care Act enhanced tax credit sunset, and these, what they'll call cuts in H.R. 1, and the Republican rhetoric is going to, understanding it's a little bit backpedaling on healthcare affordability, which is not a great issue for Republicans generally. We'll talk about fraud and abuse. We'll talk about flexibility in the market. We'll promote policies around health savings accounts, transparency, and prescription drug affordability, which you'll hear more about in the next panel. So with that, let me just talk for a minute before we get into some of the specific administration and congressional policies that they're pursuing about how I think the Trump administration generally is approaching policymaking. We joked about it a little bit with the movies, but how he's approaching things, and then specifically with healthcare. So, this is Trump 2.0. We've only had one other non-consecutive president in history. So a couple things. First, a lot of what the president is doing is unilateral. You can see here, these are executive orders and emergency declarations. He's had more than any president going back to Reagan, and frankly, even going back to FDR at the height of the New Deal. He's been a very aggressive and unilateral president, just looking at the first-year executive orders. I think a lot of traditional conservatives, we're in the land of Ronald Reagan here, or close by. A lot of traditional, Reagan, Bush conservatives sort of wondering, is this a little bit different? There are some things that are traditional Republican, but in some ways more transactional than ideological. And you see these things, I think, we haven't had a Republican president that has looked at reference pricing, for example, the drugs from foreign countries. We haven't had a president of either party that's taken a stake like this administration has in private companies like Intel and NVIDIA and others. There was another movie a couple years ago called like Everywhere All at Once. And in some ways, I think the president, he loves to dominate the news cycle, and he loves to go after folks who are his perceived enemies. So, we're taking over Greenland and Canada and Harvard and John Bolton. So that is to me, kind of the third hallmark. And then finally, I think the unpredictability in part is just his operating system, but I think it's I think it's systemic in some ways rather than just a bug. You go back to The Art of the Deal, and if you haven't seen the movie on Netflix, I think The Apprentice, it really says a lot about the president's operating style, which is he likes to keep folks off balance. So to me, this is kind of the new old operating system in Trump 2.0, and in some ways Trump 2.0 is Trump 1.0 on steroids. Now, healthcare, again, you've got some fabulous folks to sort of fill things in, but I wanted to have sort of two slides that I've been sort of put together and thinking about over the last couple of months to try to explain how the president sort of himself, I think, thinks about healthcare policy and how this administration in the various things, some of which Kristen referenced around CDC and FDA changes, and some of which at CMS is making decisions. Again, Steve and others who are super close to the administration are going to fill in a lot of these details and may challenge some of this, but I'll give you my views. So first of all, there's a lot of white space in the president's brain about healthcare. He is not a healthcare president. You could say that Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, to an extent George W. Bush with PEPFAR and prescription drugs, was a healthcare president. There's a lot of healthcare stuff and detail the president doesn't think about, but there are a couple things I do think he cares about. One is the MAHA agenda is very appealing to him, and there's this really interesting alliance, obviously, between the one Democrat in his cabinet. I think he likes the disruption, which is what the hammer is supposed to represent. And I think just the thinking outside of the box and challenging norms. And clearly there's a huge popularity to at least the food part of the MAHA agenda, less so with respect to the vaccine portion. But I do think this is something the president cares about, and I think he understands the political import of it. Secondly, the most favored nation in the drug pricing policy, Chris and I were talking about this a little bit at dinner last night. I think in the first Trump administration, he did some things around drug pricing and other things because he was focused on consumer affordability. What I've been told by folks who are in the administration now and very close to the president is he thinks about drug pricing in a little bit of a different way now. He thinks about drug pricing like he does tariffs. In other words, it's something he really cares about, and he sees it as a fact of like, America is getting screwed. We need to do something to bring down costs. It is not fair, and this is the approach. So again, there's some white space, which is what the tumbleweeds are supposed to represent, but there's a couple things he cares about. And the third thing is, he really does not like Obamacare. And I think if you ever were sort of trying to find a through line, there was a lot of back and forth in press, and Julie, you and your team were all writing about this, whether they're gonna extend the Affordable Care Act. And I never thought he was gonna, at the end of the day, support the enhanced tax credits, because at the end of the day, for him, it's sort of Obamacare. And to me, I'm way oversimplistic, but this is, I think, the things that are important to the president when you think about the health space. The second picture is when you look at this administration and you just think about it, it's a little bit difficult because it's a little bit of a Rorschach test. It's a little bit, in some ways, you see some inconsistent policies around health and healthcare. Part of it is just, as we know, healthcare itself is super complex. And part of it is, I think, that there are multiple spheres of influence within the administration. I think about them almost as kind of, swim lanes. If anyone, is a swimmer here, everyone's moving kind of in the same direction, but you're in your different lanes. And to me, that's how I think about it. It makes sense out of what I think is a more complex picture. So the first, to me, sphere is this sort of MAHA sphere, and the agencies that the impact is really having on a big part of the MAHA agenda, where Secretary Kennedy, I think, has a lot of flexibility and a lot of input, is around the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control, NIH, and around public health and nutrition policy. Whether you like it or you don't like it, that is his sphere, and you've got folks both inside and outside the administration, Dr. McCary, Carrie Means, the Surgeon General, Aaron Siri, who is an outside lawyer who is affiliated with him before, who have an influence on the secretary and are influencing policy in that realm. And I think there is some effort, I think, to curtail some of those things. If you haven't seen it, I'm not sure I recommend it, but you should go watch the Kid Rock Secretary Kennedy. Don't do it now, do it during the break. But there is some issue in maybe restraining the secretary a bit, but this is his lane. The next lane is where I think Dr. Oz operates at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and people there, and this is Medicare, Medicaid, ACA, private insurance. And the approach there is not this whole MAHA thing, but the approach there to me is a lot more of a traditional conservative market-oriented approach to market. So things like more flexibility in the Affordable Care Act, things like cracking down on fraud and abuse and intergovernmental transfers and things in Medicaid, and promoting flexibility in the private insurance market. And that's their sphere. And you don't see these intersect very much, except when the president feels like maybe they need a clinical perspective, and Dr. Oz sometimes steps into the public health space, but think about it that way. The third, to me, area is represented by the Office of Management and Budget, and Russ Vought, who's the first picture, Don Dempsey, who runs the healthcare portfolio. And these are folks who are also kind of traditional conservatives, but they're more economic conservatives, and they're focused on cost. And they're very aligned with Dr. Oz and his team, but that's, to me, part of the reason that I think, we're now past DOGE and past rescissions, and we're into a new era, but they're still concerned. And for those who looked at the Medicare Advantage rate notice the other day, or for those who were surprised that maybe the proposed updates for Medicare Advantage were lower than expected, or for those who are wondering why the president's doing what he's doing on drug pricing, it's because they care about cost to the federal government. Then you've got the political sphere, represented by folks inside and outside the White House, including the Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, and James Blair, Donald Trump Jr., and others. And then finally, Congress. And, Congress influences the president, and the president influences Congress. Most of the One Big Beautiful Bill details were filled in and written by Congress. And you saw that when the president sort of floated a trial balloon earlier on about the Affordable Care Act, some of the Republican leadership pushed back on that. And certainly, after a year of not kind of finding their footing, to say the least, the Democrats found some footing around healthcare issues, and that really was the focus of the second shutdown. So those two slides are my attempt to at least give you a framework, at least of how I think about and try to make sense of what you're going to hear about for the rest of the day, and what you see here in sort of the agenda, which I'm not going to go into all the areas, but you have the slides in your in the app. So the focus on chronic disease and epidemics, the focus on revamping vaccine policy, part of the MAHA agenda, the Affordable Care Act agenda, reducing fraud and abuse, promoting short-term limited duration plans, health savings accounts. You saw that in a proposed regulation that came out last week. In Medicare, a lot of focus on pursuing regulatory relief, a lot of focus on promoting private alternatives, a lot of focus on appropriate payment and reimbursement, some coverage through CMMI demonstrations for med tech, innovation, nutrition, where there is an intersection with the MAHA agenda, in other words. A lot of the work on Medicaid, you're going to hear from the two panels after me, you'll hear a lot more detail. The work requirements and other things are going to be a huge part, and then drug pricing, which I know you'll talk about as well. So the piece of the MAHA agenda. A couple big things coming up, which is, and again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the way the H.R. 1 bill was designed was most of the Medicaid changes, and these are the Medicaid implementation dates, don't take effect by design until after the 2026 elections. So the work requirements, the reductions on the use of provider taxes and state-directed payments, a whole bunch of other screening requirements and other things, more strict enrollment and re-enrollment requirements will all take effect. But this is the point of this slide is this is a huge implementation agenda, and the first piece of it is making sure that all 50 states by the end of this year are ready to kind of rock and roll with the work requirements. I was at a conference the other day, and there was a blue state and a red state Medicaid director, and the question was, how many states do you think will implement work requirements by the end of 2026? And the blue state health secretary said 50. And that, I think, is a huge priority for this administration to try to do that, but it'll be an enormous task. This is, by the way, I referenced at the start the One Big Beautiful Bill and the fact that there were about $4 trillion or almost $4.5 trillion in tax cuts from the standpoint of the impact on the federal budget. These are the savings provisions and some of the spending provisions in the healthcare area. And you can see the biggest ones, these are over 10 years, over $300 billion in savings over 10 years from the community engagement or the work requirements, almost $200 billion in provider tax cuts, state-directed payment reductions, about $150 billion. And then there are increased eligibility and enrollment checks, verifications for income and re-enrollment, not only in Medicaid, but in the ACA. And you see at the bottom some of the spending provisions, orphan drugs, health savings accounts, and the Rural Health Fund, which the administration will talk a lot about politically, but as you can see, the spending there is dwarfed by the savings. And that's what the Democrats will attack. So the Republicans in the campaign will focus on the tax cuts and the green part of this, and the Democrats will focus on the red parts of it. But you can see how these things stack up. And I think, and again, we'll get more detail from the expert panel in a minute, but I think this is going to put enormous downward pressure on states who are already looking at this and saying, okay, how do I do this? And you got, frankly, some blue states, including your own governor here in California, Governor Pritzker, who may have their eyes on even a bigger office, and the last thing they may want to do is raise taxes. And so they're going to look at provider cuts. They already are starting to do that, and there's going to be a downward shift. The other thing is the CBO, which is where Murray Ross was toiled before, said there were going to be at least 12 million people who will become uninsured as a result of these provisions, and maybe another 2 or 3 million, maybe 4 million as a result of the enhanced ACA credits expiring. And I don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or whether you think the policy is justified, but if we do have, and a lot of this is in the early years, you know, a dozen to more million people who are without insurance, that's also going to put pressure on emergency departments. It's also going to put pressure, guess what, on people who do have insurance, because where are hospitals and providers, many are going to shift their costs. They're going to shift to those who have insurance. So this is significant. I want to just talk in the last few minutes that I have, and I want to leave time for interaction and questions with Kristen here about the congressional health policy landscape, and then quickly politics, because Congress is going to be busy too. The conventional wisdom is kind of an election year that nothing gets done, and that may be in the case of big healthcare bills. I'll be interested in the predictions of some of my colleagues, and I can talk about some of the areas in a minute. But at the same time, you've had major bills pass in election years. You know, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, passed in an election year. Prescription drug benefits passed right at the end of an election year. The ACA passed an election year. We've got divided government and a one-vote margin for Republicans in the House, which is the smallest margin they've had since 1931. And you've got a three-vote margin in the Senate, which is not the smallest, but is very small, and it's really difficult to get things done, even when you have the majority. But I think this will be a year, given healthcare, of a lot of stage setting. And look at where we've come. I mean, this was, no wonder people are exhausted. I'm exhausted from Washington. I'm glad to be out here in the sunny weather. But, you know, we had a year where, as I said, back by July, this massive reconciliation bill has passed 6 months into the new administration. On top of all the executive orders, we had this major change in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Then we rolled right out of that to 2 consecutive government shutdowns. The key part of the government shutdown was a debate that raged on for months and months and months about the Affordable Care Act enhanced tax credits. And I think Republicans who really didn't want to do those for the most part, other than a few vulnerable Republicans, won that policy debate. But I think Democrats feel like they won the political war, because they used the shutdown, a 43-day shutdown, to raise that issue. And now, with those expiring, we're now in a new shutdown, partial shutdown, and that is over immigration and the ICE tactics and other things. But healthcare was a big part of 2025, not only in the One Big Beautiful Bill, but at the end of 2026, there were a lot of healthcare provisions that were attached to the last spending bill. And so this is a little bit of my point. This didn't get a lot of play in the press, but and I'm not going to read through all these, but here are all the Medicare and Medicaid provisions beyond the One Big Beautiful Bill that were passed on a bipartisan basis, that were part of the extender bill that passed at the end of last year. And some of these, like some of these are just traditional adjustments to Medicare payment, low volume hospitals, Medicare dependent hospitals, rural hospitals, those things that have a lot of political support. But things like the Hospital at Home program, which was a major focus in the past administration and has bipartisan support, passed for 5 years. So there'll be a lot of interest and effort, I think, around can we move more care out of the home. The telehealth flexibilities, which became temporary during COVID, have now been extended for another 2 years. So Congress is incrementally innovating in a bipartisan way. It looks incremental, but there's a lot that gets done, and this got done at the end of last year. Then there were all these public health provisions, some PBM reforms, and some FDA reforms around pediatric cancer trials, priority review vouchers, and other things. So there was a lot that got done, and I just wouldn't sleep on the fact that there is a huge interest in at least setting the stage this year, even if they have a hard time getting things done, on further PBM reforms. Question about regulation of technology and AI will be a big issue, chronic disease and other things. Affordability is going to become another issue, and I want to sort of say one thing about affordability and then segue to the elections real quickly, which is there was a hearing, there'll be a series of hearings in the House of Representatives. This was a hearing 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. The Energy and Commerce Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, which is two of the healthcare committees in the House of Representatives. If you were a Martian and you came to Washington on this day, does anyone know who Jason Smith is? Okay, does anyone know who Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is? Okay, well, it shows the power of social media over the... Chairman Smith is the chairman of the most powerful House committee, the Ways and Means Committee, a conservative Republican from rural Missouri, and you know who AOC is. So this was the tape from that day.
So we've established on the record that the largest health insurance companies are not just insurers. They are also medical providers and pharmacies. diagnosing and deciding treatment for patients. They are also PBMs, another form of middlemen managing drug benefits. They are increasingly controlling every aspect of our healthcare system.
Because whether you're a blue-blooded capitalist or a card-carrying democratic socialist, I think corporate monopolies are a problem. And this vertical integration is destroying people's ability to access care.
So one of the most conservative Republicans, one of the most liberal Democrats, and this populist focus and concern about affordability, and you can see why. These are real numbers. We don't even have them back in 1990, but just go back to 2005 and where we are now. $35,000 is the annual cost of a family of four for coverage, way outpacing. Healthcare costs, according to KFF in the poll that came out just a couple weeks ago, are the top concern. I think President Trump became president in part because of inflation concerns around gas and milk and groceries and mortgages, but you can see that healthcare is rising to the top. And Democrats have an edge on almost every one of those issues except prescription drugs, which is another reason I think the president's going to double down on that as an election message. So to me, 2026 is a really important year in terms of these things getting framed up, even if not a lot passes. And if this election is about health care, when we're back together in 2027, you're going to have a great conference because the next year's going to be all about it. I'm going to finish with this, and we'll leave a few minutes for questions. But as we look ahead to the election, I've done this chart a little bit in the past, but this, to me, shows the current state of play. These are the 10 elections in the 2 decades between JFK and Gerald Ford and Nixon. There were 3 change elections: the House, the Senate, the presidency flipped. The next 2 decades between Reagan and Clinton, you had 4 change elections. Here's where we are now. So almost every year, Democrats, you have hope. Almost every year is a change election. Middle-class voters feel increasingly crunched. Everyone does, but if you don't have a college degree or just some college, you feel particularly crunched, and healthcare, as I said, is a growing part of that. We have off-year elections. In 2025, Democrats won most of these major high-profile races, just looking at the tea leaves. This, to me, if I were Republicans running this year, would be one of the scariest slides. This is Donald Trump and Kamala Harris just on income based on exit polls. So Trump won voters, low-income voters, for the first time of almost any Republican president in decades, 50% to 48%. The Democratic Party is really the party of the educated, in fact, and wealthy. 14 of the 15 states with the highest college education voted for the Democrats. 14 of the 15 states with the least college education voted for the Republicans. But look at the economic numbers in these statewide races in New Jersey and then Virginia, which is the next one, and you can see that the Democrat in those cases won 71 and 63% of low-income voters. So that, to me, is a question of, do the tax cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill start to take effect? 2 more pictures, and then I'm going to stop, and we'll have 10 or 12 minutes of questions. The most important predictor in 2 slides of what's going to happen in the midterm is presidential approval. So Barack Obama lost 63 seats when his approval was about 45%. You can see in almost every election year going back to the 1940s, the party that is in charge loses seats in the House. The 2 exceptions were George W. Bush right after 9/11, when the country was unified, and Bill Clinton, when the public perceived Republicans as overreaching on impeachment. Other than that, this is the greatest predictor, and Republicans have a 1-seat majority. So I would not bet the House right now that Republicans will hang on. This is where Trump is right now with his approval, close to 38 or 39% overall. But Republicans have more money, and there are many, many fewer seats in play. 80% of counties who voted for one candidate in their party. Right now, 419 out of 435 seats in the House voted the same way for the president that they did for their House members. So there are fewer competitive seats. You saw California redistricting, which we can talk about. And then finally, the Senate. I think it looks like the Republicans have a good chance of hanging on unless it's a huge wave, because Democrats are going to need to win 8 of the 10 toss-up seats to do it. So we could have divided government either way. We'll continue to have a president either way. But if I'm right, I think this is going to be an important year to shape up healthcare. It's going to be a critical year in terms of the politics of healthcare. And I think 2027 and 2028, whoever is leading when we meet again next year, and I hope that you'll invite me back to be with you, we will be talking a lot about healthcare policy. So thank you very much. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dean, for that really insightful presentation. Your presentation actually reminded me that when I was in high school, my AP US History and government teacher said, every election is about the economy, and anyone who forgets that loses. And I think you teed up really nicely what I wanted to ask you, which is, clearly affordability is going to be a key part of the 2026 elections, and healthcare is going to be a major part of that. Sort of reading the tea leaves in your last couple of slides, if the Democrats take the House back, what's around the corner for healthcare? Are there areas for bipartisanship, or is it just going to be gridlock?
Well, that's a great question. I think first of all, again, I would say we are still a year out. So reading the tea leaves today, I would say at least the House, as you said, Kristen, will probably have a Democratic majority, and that'll be a divided government. They'll spend I think the president, a lot of time of oversight of this administration, maybe impeachment and other things that they'll have to do for their base. And it may not be an environment ripe for bipartisanship. But I do think that there are opportunities, and I'll mention a quick thing in terms of the atmosphere and then a couple things specific in policy. One is, President Trump has not done a lot of bipartisan deals. Most of the big bills that he's passed have been the 2 tax cut bills with Republicans only. But he likes a deal. He likes the art of the deal. And a lot of the things that he's in favor of, we'll hear what my colleagues think in the next panel, but I think the president's policies, if you just look at them substantively, for example, on drug pricing, are to the left of where some of the Democratic policies were in the last Congress. So I think there's an opportunity, if the president views it from his standpoint of legacy and achievement, for him to say, look, I'll work with Hakeem Jeffries if he's the Speaker of the House. We'll get some things done. And I think, you saw the clip that we just talked about with affordability. There's concerns. There was a bipartisan bill that Josh Hawley, a populist conservative from Missouri, introduced last week with a senator from Massachusetts, whose name I'm drawing a blank on, Warren, that would break up healthcare monopolies. So you can see this sort of populism of allowing people to have more flexibility, of concerns about the integration, not just with health plans, but hospitals and other providers, antitrust and other things. You could see further reforms around PBMs and drug pricing. And I think on this affordability bent, again, in a non-election year, some of the Republican ideas about giving money directly to individuals through HSAs or account-based plans, you could marry that with some ideas around, revising the Affordable Care Act and providing a different kind of enhanced subsidy. So I think it's tough because it's all like a perpetual election year in Washington, but there are some substantive areas that if the parties view it in their political interest, where I think there is some alignment. You saw some of that in the slides.
Yeah. And I wanted to dig in on some of the HR 1 spending reductions before we open it up to audience questions. Combined, as you noted, a majority of the spending reductions come from healthcare cuts, and combined, the limits on provider taxes and state-directed payments, I think it's $340 billion around,
It's a lot of
savings.
money, even in Washington.
It's the greatest cuts come from the limits on those taxes, which are sort of like fundamental cornerstone funding mechanisms for Medicaid programs in, I think, every state but Alaska. And to sort of put that into perspective for the audience, California gets about $5 billion a year from its provider tax and $7 billion a year from its managed care organization tax. California's program is obviously much larger than any other state, but it's a lot of money at play for every single state trying to fund its Medicaid program. When we hit that wall in 2027, what do you think the realities are going to be for states having to deal with those massive reductions in federal contributions?
Well, I think you've got as I mentioned, you've got a panel of folks who are much more expert than me about how states are dealing with it. My tea leaves are, as I said briefly, that there's going to be a lot of downward pressure on provider rates. I think there's going to be a lot of look at innovation. Can we leverage technology and some of the solutions to try to extend care, particularly in rural and other areas? What's sort of implied in your question, I think one of the questions around Washington that's starting to get some buzz is, will there be any restoration, even with Democrats, if the Democrats do take the House, will there be any pushback or any delay of some of those cuts? And my view is maybe, but I'm really skeptical, and I'll tell you why I'm skeptical. The cost of you saw the cost of the savings, but the cost of restoring those is really expensive. So this year, in a bipartisan way, really since the Affordable Care Act was passed, both parties have said we're going to delay cuts to hospital disproportionate share payments, which help prop up a lot of hospitals. In the early years of doing that, the cost of doing that, or the savings from it to the federal government, was like less than $1 billion. This year was $8 billion to delay DSH cuts for 1 year, $8 billion. Well, when you look at the savings from these provisions, and therefore the cost of pushing it back from a federal deficit standpoint, when you add up the DSH payments at $8 billion, let's say $10 billion, and the 1 year cost, even in the foothills of these policies in 2027 and 28 of the provider taxes and the state-directed payments, it's like $20 to $30 billion. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's a lot. And Congress has not been in the mood to just say, oh, we'll just spend 20 or 30. What they do is they say, well, we'll do that, but we'll cut somewhere else. So where are they going to cut? Coding intensity for Medicare Advantage plans, the health plans will scream. There's not enough PBM savings. Are they going to give that back to the hospitals, who are mostly beneficiaries of the provider taxes, and then therefore go cut site neutral payments in Medicare? So to me, the math doesn't add up. And I think because of that, the states are going to be living under some form of this, which doesn't mean that the work requirements aren't going to be moderated as we see how they carry out, which doesn't mean that there won't be other ways that states will get creative in terms of financing their Medicaid programs. We've always seen, but I don't think that this is going to be undone in a massive way. I think the states are going to have to wrestle with it, as are probably all the stakeholders in the room.
All right, I think hopefully we have time for like 1 or 2 audience questions.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, I think a man is coming with a microphone.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we live in an era that everything is politic, and also healthcare included, but that's what I see on the surface. I think in my opinion, the main issue is that all the stakeholders in this healthcare environment, we as providers have no voice. And since we have no voice, regardless of it's Republican or Democrat, we haven't seen any healthcare reform that actually helps the people. So my question to both of you is that, two questions. How can we give voice to people who have no voice, being the providers, and also the people, and also how can we educate them about it? Because we hear that healthcare cost is going up, but nobody dissects that and find out what exactly causing it. We know that a lot of it is because of administrative cost. We know that the lobbyists have a lot of power, regardless if they're Democrats or Republicans, that would not allow any major change in healthcare. How can we change that dynamic? Thank you.
Talk to reporters. No, but I mean, sort of seriously, I think, in my opinion, right, like, you shouldn't underestimate the power of story, the Academy Award nominees. I think that one of the things as a reporter amidst all of this uncertainty in the past year that's been challenging is that it has been hard to get to those sort of real person voices, the providers and the patients, because people are, for good reason, scared when things are uncertain. But at the same time, it's when those stories of like personal turmoil are really powerful that leaders start to take notice. I know even just in my own reporting, around the health policy with the California state legislature, like we've gotten laws passed, we've gotten policies changed just from, people being willing to speak up about how this is making a real impact in their lives.
I think be brief. I think that Kristen hit on it. The local, if you look at power, it's really local right now. It's not just the storytelling, but it's the local impact. To me, all the data points that we just showed you, they're just not really sustainable when you think about what it means for a person's pocketbook. And that's why I think this next election and what the voters are probably going to say is going to have a huge impact, because the question is what is happening to consumers. And I think the power of that, who spend a lot less money lobbying, is what compelled those two very different members of Congress to say really critical things about industry. But the stakeholders themselves really have to get together because they're part of the problem in driving up costs. But I think Kristen's exactly right. It's the power of the people, the local story. And I think these trend lines in real people's lives in healthcare are unsustainable. And that's what elections are about. And that's what drives policy.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen and Dean, for offering your insights. And I hope we can continue this conversation later. So thank you very much.
Thank you.